Okay, and I have a full connection. Welcome, everyone, to session number 10 of an introduction to biblical prophecy. We're 10 weeks into this study, and we're just finishing up the book of Daniel. We'll start in chapter 11. The book of Daniel is all about the long-term program of God for the end of history. It begins back in the time of Daniel. We've looked at the time of the Gentiles, which is the four nations, followed by 10, followed by a one and a three, and the antiChrist, and all of that. We've looked at that program and discovered that we're probably living during the days of the final beast. We're going to see later on that this final beast, this fourth beast, has a death and then a kind of resurrection out of which develop 10 kings or 10 kingdoms. And shortly after that time, there'll be a time of wars and rumors of wars, and terrible tribulation, followed by the second coming of Christ and the beginning of the millennial kingdom. That's the overall pattern which the Old Testament in particular lays out for the end of time, if we take all of these things literally. And that's what I've been doing. Now, by the way, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Dr. John McMath. I'm retired from the Moody Bible Institute, and I'm joined here today, as every Wednesday, with my friends in Italy and in the Philippines. And we always look forward to this time and also record it for, I don't know, posterity. Maybe my wife will get to watch this next week. We'll see. we're in chapter 11 of Daniel. Last week we noted in chapters 10 and in chapter 11 that history is predicted in the prophets, often with great precision. That there is in addition to the human history that surrounds us and that we're living in, there is a spiritual conflict going on that God understands full well. And he and his people are involved in a spiritual conflict that involves spiritual discipline on our part, prayer, one of the most important components, the power that the angels have for the battle on earth appears to have a connection to our prayers. And I can't entirely explain that. Other scholars have noticed exactly the same thing, even non-scholars, and have written books about this, novels. And there's clearly something going on there, and a great deal of it, I suppose, we won't understand until heaven. But the predictions that Daniel is given are very specific. And as we get into chapter 11, we see a whole bunch of very identifiable and very dateable historical events. The Battle of Marathon, where the Persians attacked Greece and were defeated by the men of Athens. The Bible just says the king of Persia, doesn't mention his name, but today, of course, we know his name. This was a Darius, and he came up against the Greeks, and the Greeks are simply called the king of Greece came up. It actually says that, but we know who that king was. We know it was the king of Athens, and that battle was fought in a plain called Marathon on the coast. The landing Persians were defeated there and forced to go home. That was the beginning of a very long Persian war that ended with Alexander the Great. Chapter 11 gives us numerous details about that period And as we read the history of the period, mostly Tacitus and Josephus, the secular historians who lived at about the time of Christ. And were writing histories based on their own primary sources. So both Josephus and Tacitus are very reliable historians. They're as reliable as modern professional historians, which is to say pretty reliable. It's not a guarantee, it's not inerrant, but it's pretty reliable. When we compare the secular history with the predictions made in Daniel, we find precision after precision after precision after precision. There's a deliberate obscurity in the message. And yet, once the prediction has been fulfilled, it's easy to pick up on it. We can see who this is. When we get to the middle of chapter 11, we, as scholars, I say we, notice at some point, whether that's verse 32, verse 35, verse 36, or verse 37, and it doesn't really matter much, but somewhere in there, we stop talking about the evil king of Syria, whose name is Antiochus Epiphanes, who was a genuinely awful guy, who committed the abomination of desolation, sacrificed a pig on the altar in Jerusalem, a genuinely awful person. Okay. There's no way you can think of him in a sympathetic way. He was a very bad man and died in exile. Nothing good came of Antiochus Epiphanes. In the next few verses, we see the evil king. We're being, and it could still be Antiochus. And there's a section here that could still be talking about Antiochus, but then it becomes clear that it's predicting things that, one, did not happen during the intertestamental period, did not happen during the life and ministry of Christ or the early church. It simply didn't happen. And when we read the histories of that period, and we have lots of them, nothing like this, nothing identifiable with any of these specifics seems to have happened. And then as the chapter goes on, it becomes clear that the Bible isn't talking about Antiochus anymore, but rather about the end of history and a willful king who typified or symbolized by Antiochus is actually what we commonly call the antichrist. This willful king, this stern-faced king, this man of sin, who is described in all of those ways in the Bible. An evil king of the end time who will be a primary player during what the New Testament calls the Great Tribulation. Now, the Old Testament predicts a day of Jacob's trouble and a day of terrible trial for the people of Israel, just preceding the arrival of Messiah to win the final battle and initiate the kingdom age. That's uniform, and we'll look at a few of those specific verses here in a few minutes. But we see that pattern. There is a pattern in the end of history that involves, one, a return of Israel to the land. Two, the rise of the evil, stern-faced king who will arrive with wars and rumors of war in his trail. There will be terrible tribulation for the Jewish people in the land, and at the same time, a time of great blessing, as hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of Jewish people will be saved during this time. And it will be followed by a climactic, terrible battle for Jerusalem that will be ended by the second coming of Christ, and then the beginning of the kingdom age, where Christ rules from Jerusalem over Israel and all the rest of the world for 1,000 years. And that's the pattern that is clear in the Old Testament. And as we walk through this chapter, we're going to see that from about verse 36 on, all the way through chapter 12, we're talking about the end time. So let me get the share screen up if I can manage it. Yeah, that looks good. Let's see what happens. Ooh, it's trying. Yes, look at that. I'm always impressed when any of this happens. Okay, so I've got my Bible here, and I'm going to get started in about verse 36, because that's as good as any. At verse 36 of chapter 11, it is by just about everyone agreed that we're not talking about the same character anymore. Something has really happened. It may be earlier than that, but by verse 36, we're talking about the end time. There are some interpreters who hold that this entire chapter, all the way to the end of chapter 12, is really only about the intertestamental period. So all of this was fulfilled 150 years before Christ, and none of it has any application to anything at all anywhere else. And it obviously doesn't have any significance for us. We call that the preterist view. The view that prophecy is always fulfilled in the past and there's no future. There's no end time coming. These folks are usually amillennial. They don't believe there's a millennium coming. They are sometimes, they call themselves other things, but they tend to be amillennial. There's no millennium coming. There's no end time sequence coming. There's no tribulation coming. There's no rapture coming. There's nothing coming. The antiChrist doesn't exist. None of this will happen. Armageddon won't happen. None of that. I prefer to believe that God communicates consistently. That if he's trying to communicate truth to us, he will do that with precision and tell us exactly what he wants us to know. So I don't believe we need to play games with Scripture. I believe the Bible means what it says. It still requires serious study, but it means what it says. So that's where I'm going to begin. So as we start off, and the king shall do as he wills. Okay, there's that willful king. And this, of course, could be Antiochus, but not quite. He shall exalt himself and magnify himself above every god and speak astonishing things against the God of gods. And again, that could kind of almost be Antiochus. He shall prosper till the indignation is accomplished. For what is decreed shall be done. Okay, now that's different. The indignation, very interesting word there. It usually refers to a desecration of Jerusalem. That could be two things. That could be the indignation of the time of the Maccabees, when the Jewish rebels took back Jerusalem. It could be fulfilled then. But that would be rather meaningless as it goes on into this paragraph. Verse 37, he shall pay no attention to the gods of his fathers, or to the one beloved by women. Okay, now what is that all about? He shall not pay attention to any other god, for he shall magnify himself above all. Okay. Uh, this gets harder and harder to uh, identify with Antiochus, for Antiochus didn't have a god of his fathers. That just doesn't fit in any way. The term God there is singular. If this were a Greek ruler, as Antiochus more or less was, it would have been the gods of his fathers, lowercase g. But this is clearly the God of his fathers, nor the one beloved of women. Now, what is that about? Well, the simple answer is we don't know. Some commentators have suggested the one beloved of women is Christ. And so he has forgotten the God of his fathers, or no longer cares about the God of his fathers, but he is certainly not a Christian. Some have suggested because of this that this character is Jewish. That doesn't make very good sense to me, but it is a possibility, and some have suggested that. I think it's more likely that this character is Muslim. Muslims worship a single God, or so they say. Uh, and he has no respect for the one beloved of women. So he is not Christian. He is very likely not Jewish. Of the monotheistic religions, that leaves Islam. I can't say that for sure, but that seems very likely. If this is true, then he is perhaps an apostate Muslim, or a Muslim who is primarily Muslim in name or culture, whoever he is. And I'm not going to take any guesses. Whoever he is, he considers himself the most important God. He's a very selfish character. He's a hard-faced, willful, irreligious desecrator. He's not a very good guy, not a good guy at all. Uh, and so we have all of this. He's going to magnify himself. He shall honor the God of fortresses instead of these. Okay, a God of fortresses. Just think about what a God is. A God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. So if you've been reading your Bible and you're a Christian, and you believe it's important to be in church and walk with God and pray, then you would probably say that the God of reality, the God of the Bible, the Father of Jesus, Jesus himself, and the Holy Spirit are in fact the God who must be magnified. This is the God that you would honor with your life, with your substance, with your resources, and all others would be ignored or put in the third or fourth place roles where they maybe belong. This hard-faced king, this ruler who will appear, honors a God of fortresses. When you honor a God of fortresses, that means you spend your money, and the money that you extort from your people in order to build weapons of war, fortresses, military emplacements and encampments, machines for attacking your enemies. That's always a bad thing. When any nation becomes warlike and begins going across borders to make war with new and interesting enemies, that's a bad thing. That's never, ever a good thing. Wars of conquest are always wrong. and the people who do them are generally evil people. And so there's a lot to choose from. If we're looking through history for an excellent candidate for antichrist, it's probably a mistake to pick every arrogant, selfish, militaristic leader. I mean, there have been literally thousands of them through time. And everybody who's picked one of those and identified him as the Antichrist has been wrong every last time. This is partially because I'll share an idea here that you perhaps will find helpful, and that is that when Jesus left, just before he left, he was having a conversation with his disciples, and they said, "What will be the sign of the end and the sign of your coming, and the beginning of the kingdom age?" And he went on to answer that, and in his answer, he said, among other things, that there will be many antichrist. There will be many who will come and deceive. There'll be false prophets, and let none deceive you. For you're going to be looking for just the one. And the reason is that no one knows the day or the hour of my appearing except the Father alone. And Jesus is making it clear that even he, at that point in time, doesn't know the day or the hour of the second coming. He knows the general structure because that's established from eternity past, but the specific point in time, Jesus doesn't know. And an extension of that I think is very important is that Satan also doesn't know. He has even a less precise knowledge of the end time than Jesus does. So he really doesn't know. He knows that when the church is taken up out of the way, he's going to have precisely 7 years to do what he can, what he will, to take over the world and become his own version of God. Satan will have that one chance to make it or break it. And so ever since Jesus left to go to heaven, Satan has had an antichrist character out in the world. He's always been there. So Nero, the emperor of Rome at the time of the early church, would have made a very good antichrist. He was an excellent candidate for this. Others through history could have done it. Leo X, who precipitated the Reformation, could have been the Antichrist. I would give him that in a minute. Some others, Napoleon would have done it. Adolf Hitler would have made a great Antichrist. He was really good for that. Joseph Stalin could have been the Antichrist. A few years ago, my students, a group of my students in one of my classes, went through a study of biblical numerology, and they transliterated my name into Hebrew, took the numbers for that, added them up, divided them by something else, and came up with 666. And so they proved by that I am the Antichrist. I gave them points for effort on that because it was a really hard project. But anybody can be the Antichrist according to these rules. So it's a mistake for us to identify anybody. Is there anybody alive right now who'd make a good Antichrist? Yes. Oh, yes. I can give you the names of half a dozen that would be just fine. If we narrow it down a little bit, if the fourth kingdom of Daniel is the Islamic Caliphate, and a reborn caliphate appears on the earth, uh, which is what ISIS was trying to do. It's what the Iranians are trying to do. It's what the Turks are dreaming of today. It's what the Egyptian rulers off and on have been trying to do. And that's the point of much of the behind the scenes struggle in the Middle East today. They would love to reestablish the caliphate that was ended in 1923 when the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Muslim Empire in that part of the world, was disbanded, and the Middle East was broken up into independent separate nations by the great powers at the end of World War I. If that Muslim caliphate comes back together, the head man will be, depending on the group that wins, whether Sunni or Shiite, Egyptian or Turkish or Persian. He'll be the imam, or he'll be the last or 12th imam. He'll be perhaps the Mahdi, according to the Persians. So there will be this special holy man at the very end of time. Now that's not in the Quran. That's in the other literature of Islam. They're expecting this, and that ruler will put an end to Israel and will reestablish control over all of the city of Jerusalem and push the evil Jews into the Mediterranean. That's their dream. Now, if you ask yourself today, which nations have that dream today? Well, it's very easy to give you that list. And there are quite a lot of them. So is that a possibility? Yes, I think it really is. I think it really is. But who is the Antichrist? I don't know. It would probably have to depend. But I believe that this world ruler is, among other things, a genuinely evil character who has given up on the God of his fathers. A God whom his fathers did not know, he shall honor with gold and silver, precious stones, and gifts. Verse 39, he shall deal with the strongest fortresses with the help of a foreign god. Is this another king, or is this a demonic power? Can't tell you. There's that deliberate obscurity going. This hasn't happened yet. Those who acknowledge him, he shall lead with honor, or load with honor. He shall make them rulers over many, and shall divide the land for a price. So he's going to divide the land. In particular is the land of Israel, almost always. And he'll come through quickly. He's going to knock down the strongest fortresses. And like a whirlwind, he is going to control that part of the world. The world for the people of Daniel's day meant the Middle East. And the usual suspects, the powers who are involved in all of this, are Middle Eastern powers. So the land will be the Middle East, and he will accept bribes from the various powers in return for power over sections of the land. I think it's fairly clear what is being implied there. Then verse 40, we're introduced to a great war. I should mention the world religion of the time. The ruler is at least a Middle Eastern ruler. This is the evil king. The world religion, I believe, is likely to be a form of Islam. It won't be something that will be accepted by everybody any more than Islam was accepted by the people who were conquered. in the 640s, 700s AD. But by force, people will have to acknowledge that this great king rising in the Middle East is in fact powerful enough to demand allegiance. I believe truly that a form of Islam is a possibility for this world religion. I do not believe that it's any form of Christianity. Those who believe that the Antichrist has to be the Pope in Rome and that Roman Catholicism is the world religion simply haven't read history, and that has never really been a possibility. But Islam has the built-in desire to be a world religion. Thirdly, a world war, or at least a very great war. The Antichrist is a war maker. Look at verse 40. At the time of the end, we'll just start there. At the time of the end. Again, this cannot be Antiochus Epiphanes, because Antiochus Epiphanes died in exile in Syria. He didn't do this. This thing simply didn't happen. At the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him. Okay, the him is the willful king. This is the Antichrist character. The king of the south usually refers to Africa and Arabia. Okay, so what kind of coalition could come from there? Well, quite a number, and we're not really told what that will be. The king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind. Okay, so we've got a coalition between a king of the south and a king of the north. In the north, we have Syria, Mesopotamia, Asia Minor, which is modern Turkey, Persia, and a southern tier of the old Russian coalition, what we call the stands: Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, all the other stands that are in that lower tier. Those are primarily Muslim. Some have argued that Russia itself is involved in this war. And I don't see that as necessary, but it's a possibility. Again, we're not told. Is anybody else involved? Well, some have argued that China could be involved in this, providing large numbers of infantry. I think that's a possibility. As we get into the book of Revelation, we'll see an army of 200 million. China could do that, particularly if they ended up spending the next 100 years building trucks and learning how to actually do logistics. But China's a possibility. Islam, if you were to add together all of the armies of all of the populations of the earth, about a third of the world's population is Islam. If all of those people were to get together and put together an army, they could easily come up with 200 million soldiers. Maybe not good soldiers, but they could come up with 200 million of them. And again, they would have to learn logistics, something they've never done well. This war, as is described here, seems to develop into a worldwide conflict. Other nations will be drawn into this. If there is still a United States, it would be difficult to imagine it not wanting to get involved. The kinds of leaders that America has had the last 50 years or so mostly have wanted to start wars rather than stop them. And I can see the Americans getting involved. The Europeans, for the most part, have not been enthusiastic about starting wars. They've had a couple of really bad ones in the last 100 years. So maybe not so much. Most of the rest of the world has a much lower ability to participate in a worldwide war, but the wars could happen locally. Uh, the book of Matthew 24, Jesus speaks of wars and rumors of wars. The first horse in the book of Revelation is the white horse with a rider with a bow. So there's a war at a distance, not right there. He's always fighting a war. Is this what the Antichrist is up to? Well, very likely. But I think this particular war is a description of the final war of that tribulation period. At that time, at the time of the end, the king of the south shall attack him, but the king of the north shall rush upon him like a whirlwind, with chariots and horsemen and many ships. And he shall come, he, the Antichrist, shall come into countries and shall overflow and pass through. He shall come into the glorious land. So he will finally attack Israel, and tens of thousands shall fall, but these shall be delivered out of his hand. Edom, Moab, and the main part of the Ammonites, which is the modern nation of Jordan. And we're not told why. I don't need to tell you at this point that nothing like this has ever happened in history. It just can't be equated. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. He shall become ruler of the treasures of gold and silver and all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Cushites shall follow in his train. So he's defeating this southern coalition. For a moment, he's leaving the northern coalition out of this, but going after the African, Libyan. Libya is still Libya. Egypt is Egypt, and Cush is the Sudan, Ethiopia, and that eastern horn of Africa. He shall stretch out his hand against the countries and become powerful. But verse 44, news from the east and the north shall alarm him, and he shall go out with great fury to destroy and devote many to destruction. And he shall pitch his palatial tents between the sea and the glorious holy mountain. Yet he shall come to his end with none to help him. Okay, that portion of it describes an attack on the forces of the kings of the north and the east. North would be directly north from Egypt, will be Asia Minor, Turkey. East will be Mesopotamia and Persia. Are there others involved in this who are farther in those directions? Those would be other Muslim nations a bit farther. China and Russia may feel the need to be involved in this. At any rate, there's a coalition coming from the north. He pitches his tent near the glorious holy mountain. That's Mount Zion. That's the Temple Mount, Jerusalem. So that's the focus of this terrible war. It's this war, whatever it is a war that brings this time of terrible tribulation for Israel to a climax. The end, the whole end time, the 7 years and probably some years before that, will be marked by war. There is one key war that we sometimes call Armageddon. It's not necessarily the best name for this closing war, but the book of Revelation uses that name, and it's gotten to be popular. Let me tell you just a few things about this. First, this involves a coalition of the group that I've been calling the usual suspects. I'm quoting from an old movie called Casablanca, uh, where Louis, the French policeman, says, "Round up the usual suspects." That it's kind of a funny line, but I'm using that term to include the states and people groups, people primarily, who surround Israel and have been the opponents of Israel throughout all of history, from the very earliest times, from the time that Abraham came into the land. The surrounding peoples have been enemies of Israel. And many of them have their roots in Abraham through Ishmael or through his nephew Lot. These are not good things. Even through Abraham himself, through his Arab wife Keturah after. What was it? I think Keturah after Sarah died. So many of these people groups became great nations around the Middle East. So the short distances, you've got places like Syria and the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Moabites, Philistines, the Sidonians. These people groups are today all Muslim. Farther afield, you've got Asia Minor, Mesopotamia, Persia, the farther reaches toward the north. You've got the Arabs in Saudi Arabia, the Persian Gulf. You've got the North African people groups, Libya, Kush, Egypt. All of these today are Muslim. So there's all of this going on. So a coalition of the usual suspects. And there seems to be, secondly, here an attack between the antichrist and two separate coalitions, a northern group and a southern group, who will both attack the antichrist in Israel. So the focus, this is the third point here, will be Jerusalem itself. The focus of this final war will be Jerusalem. In the process, the attackers, both Northern and Southern coalition and the Antichrist himself, will be destroyed. In the Bible, the predictions of this final war are described in a variety of different places. There is, of course, in Revelation 21, this war is called Armageddon. And a list of rulers who participate in the war is given to us there. With some difficulties, we don't entirely understand who all of them are. In Ezekiel 38 and 39, there's a battle called Gog and Magog. And some have preferred to put this after the millennium. I think that's a possibility. Most put this prior to the millennial kingdom. And I think that's probably right, but we don't have a lot of precision. When we compare the people groups who are involved in the Gog and Magog war with the War of the Three Kings that is described here in Daniel, it looks an awful lot like the same war. And I'm not going to disagree with that. So you've got you've got Armageddon, you've got Gog and Magog, you've got the War of Three Kings, Daniel 11, and we've got another in the book of Zechariah, so a place that we don't get to very often, is described the siege of Jerusalem, which is preceded by the return of Jewish people from all over the world back to Israel, and is followed by the appearance of Messiah the King. So the Zechariah 9 through 12 battle is probably also the same battle. They're all one. In Isaiah 22 to 24, After a description in chapters 13 through 21 or early part of 22 of the destruction of all of the nations of the ancient world, whom I call the usual suspect. After our individual declarations of condemnation are given to each of those nations, there is a gigantic war that happens just before the arrival of the king, the Messiah, and involves a universal desolation of all of the land. That probably means all of the land of all of the surrounding invaders. And this is called the Battle of the Valley of Vision, or the Valley of Jehoshaphat. Is this the same as the Battle of Armageddon? Well, it could be. Or the War of the Three Kings? Well, it happens at the same time. Or the Siege of Jerusalem? Yes, the Valley of Vision is right outside of Jerusalem. I think the Old Testament and the New Testament are unanimous that there's a great battle focusing on Jerusalem at the end of time, after the restoration of the nation to the land and before the coming of the Messiah. I think the Old Testament is unanimous on this, and the New Testament simply agrees with that. Matthew 24, Luke 21 describe this time as a great tribulation for Israel. And certainly as we get into chapter 12, we're going to see that that's true. In the midst of this, a deliverance for God's people. And God's people, as Daniel would understand it, would be the Jewish people. Now, I think there are Gentiles who are saved during that period, but they won't be part of the church as such. They'll be part of God's people, but I think we're required by the evidence to make a distinction between the church and the larger group that we call God's people. There are some of God's people who, because they were believers before the first coming of Christ or after the church is taken out of the world, are really not a part of the church. And among other things, that means that the church is not the beginning or the end of all things. There's something else in God's plan, something bigger than the church. I think it's important for us to recognize that. At the end of this terrible end time, with all the blessings and the judgments, there are resurrections for those who are blessed, God's people, and judgment on all of the rest. There is a reward promised for those who are God's people. So we're looking at a final judgment, and then for the survivors of all of this, there is a millennium followed by the eternal state. And in my pattern, I make a distinction between the millennial kingdom, which is a seventh and last test of mankind to demonstrate still more truth, and then the eternal state, when heaven and earth will be replaced by a new heaven and a new earth. Everything will be made new. Sin will be cast into the lake of fire. Satan will be utterly destroyed. And sin will be no more. Evil will be no more. Death will finally be utterly destroyed. That's a good thing. Let me begin at chapter 12 and verse 1. At that time shall arise Michael, the great prince, who has charge of your people. There shall be a time of trouble, sometimes translated tribulation, such as had never been since there was a nation until that time. But at that time your people shall be delivered, every one whose name shall be found written in the book. And many of those who sleep in the dust of the earth shall awake. That's the resurrection. Some to everlasting life, and some to shame and everlasting contempt. And those who are wise shall shine like the brightness of the sky above. And those who turn many to righteousness, like the stars forever. But you, Daniel, shut up the words and seal the book until the time of the end. Okay, this has to do with the time of the end. By shut up the words and seal the book, God intends for Daniel to close his book, stop writing, because this refers to the time of the end. When we come to the time of the end, those of us who are still reading books at that time will look at this and understand that this has been fulfilled. And then I, Daniel, looked, and behold, two others stood on this bank of the stream, and on the one on that bank. And someone said to the man clothed in linen who was above the waters, "How long shall it be till the end of these wonders?" And I heard the man clothed in linen who was above the waters of the stream. He raised his right hand and his left hand toward the heaven, and swore by him who lives forever that it would be a time, times, and a half a time. Okay, if we understand the times the same as usual, this is going to be years, 3.5 years. Is this the first or the second? Well, it's hard to know, probably the second. When the shattering of the power of the holy people comes to an end, and all these things would be finished. So we're looking at the climax of the end time era in a 3.5 year period that Jesus in Matthew 24 calls a great tribulation. We'll see how that works in the book of Revelation when we get there. And he said, verse 9, "Go your way, Daniel, for the words are shut up and sealed until the time of the end. Many shall purify themselves, make themselves white, and be refined. But the wicked shall act wickedly, and none of the wicked shall understand. But those who are wise shall understand. And from that time on, the regular burnt offering is taken away, and abomination that makes desolate is set up. There shall be 1,290 days. Blessed is he who waits and arrives at the 1,335 days. Roughly 3.5 years. It's a little hard to know. But you go your way till the end, and you shall rest and stand in your allotted place at the end of the days. Okay. All right. Well, there's a lot of stuff going on here. I didn't mention verse 5, many shall run to and fro, and knowledge shall increase. Characteristics of the end time. World travel and an exponential increase in knowledge. That's certainly happening in our day. How much farther will it go before the end? Okay, we don't know. I'm going to teach you an answer that fits on many prophetic themes, and I'm going to end the share here. What can we know for sure? Well, we can know the pattern that is established here. This is a biblical pattern. This is an Old Testament pattern. When we read the Old Testament prophets, they're in agreement that at the end of time, Israel will return to the land. There will be a time of agreement with a terrible king that we call the antiChrist. There will be wars and rumors of wars, and then terrible judgment from God. The wars will come to a climax outside of Jerusalem when the evil ones will be destroyed, and Messiah will stand on the earth and usher in the millennial kingdom. The Old Testament is unanimous about this. We find this literally in all of the prophets. We can go back to the book of Deuteronomy and see the first pictures of this. When the New Testament begins to speak of the church's involvement in the end time, it also builds on this Old Testament pattern, looking forward to the end time. The belief of conservatives that Paul is speaking in the Thessalonian epistles, the Corinthian epistles, others in some other places, about a rapture of the church out of the world prior to the 7-year tribulation period is not wishful thinking. That's built on this unanimous belief of the Old Testament prophets that the center of the end time events is all on Israel. The 70th week is called the Day of Jacob's Trouble. This is a great tribulation for Israel. And the church is simply not mentioned. One reason I haven't mentioned the church in this discussion of the book of Daniel is that Daniel isn't about the church. And there's very little for the church to be concerned about in either the book of Daniel or in the other Old Testament prophets. When we get to the New Testament, we're going to find some references to the church, but not during this tribulation period. When Paul says that we shall not all sleep, but we shall all be changed in a moment, a twinkling of an eye, and we will be transformed, he's talking about the rapture. When he gets into the Thessalonian epistles, both first and second, he makes it clear that the church will be taken up out of the way. The judgment of the church is a separate event from the earthly judgment on Israel and on the nations. So that's what that's built on. Now, a lot of people don't like the doctrine of the rapture, don't like teaching about it, and I'm okay with that. I don't teach a lot about it either, but it's what the Bible says, and this is where that comes from. Next week we will go on to look at some New Testament passages. I want to look at both Matthew 24 and Luke 21 and see what Jesus has to say about the climax of the time of the Gentiles, because that's also important. It shouldn't take us more than 1 or 2 weeks to go through both of those, but we'll see. I still have to write the outline for that. So we'll get back and do that. Let me unmute everybody, because I've gone just a little longer than I intended to. Okay, there we go. Okay, thanks everybody for coming. I always appreciate this group so much. You guys are faithful. Yes, you show up in the middle of the evening, the middle of the night, to listen to an old by-doggies preacher in North Idaho ruminate about stuff I've been studying for the last 50 years or so. So I hope I'm right about some of it, but maybe that's just pride speaking. We all know what happens with that. All right, everybody. Love you all. We'll see you next week as we jump into the New Testament. God bless. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Dr.
My pleasure. Love you guys. Ciao, ciao. Dutch Vedanya, or whatever it takes where you're from.